Aloha. Welcome to the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies Transnational Crime Series Take20. Today's topic is Illuminating Dark Fishing Fleets in North Korea. We will have a presentation followed by a Q&A. We are honored to have two exceptional speakers today. Dr. Katherine Seto is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. As an interdisciplinary scholar, her research interest lies at the intersection of political ecology, governance theory, and sustainable science. She is currently exploring four areas: the socio-ecological consequences of competition between small-scale and industrial fishing in West Africa, the management of tuna fisheries in Western and Central Pacific Ocean, the broad relationship between fisheries and social conflict, and the role of seafood in local and global food systems. Katie holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and an MAS from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She joins us today from Australia. Jaeyoon Park is a senior data scientist at the Global Fishing Watch, which is an ocean conservation nonprofit group co-founded by Google. Born and raised in Asia, Jaeyoon leads research projects in collaboration with regional fisheries research institutes and national government agencies. For more than a decade, he has been working at the intersection point between technology and conservation. He holds a BS in computer science from KAIST, which is a national research institution in South Korea, and an MS in environmental engineering from École des Mines Paris. His past work experience includes lab research at Veolia Environment, business engagement at the World Wildlife Foundation Korea, and climate policy at the UN Environment Asia Pacific. Jaeyoon joins us today from Paris, France. Please welcome our speakers.
I'm Jaeyoon. So I'm a senior data scientist and research lead for Asia at Global Fishing Watch, which works to provide monitoring, control, and surveillance support to governments to assist their efforts to tackle illegal, unreported, unregulated IUU fishing and ensuring fisheries sustainability with our satellite big data analytics and machine learning techniques. And I'll leave Katie to say hello to the audience.
Yeah, hi. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks Inez for that really great introduction. As she mentioned, I am an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz in Santa Cruz, California, and yeah, I'm looking forward to today.
Great. So we are going to, So we are going to talk briefly about the paper, scientific paper that we published in Science Advances in this summer, July 22nd. And we're going to talk about the background of the research and key findings and technologies that we used, and also obviously implications and impacts of this study to transboundary fisheries management in the region. So there you go. So first of all, very quickly, Global Fishing Watch is an international nonprofit NGO that visualizes and tracks global fishing activity in near real time and for free to improve ocean sustainability through increased transparency in fishing. And we do this through artificial intelligence and big data analysis. And in particular, we use a lot of satellite vessel tracking data, which is called Automatic Identification System, or AIS. And the fact that we use satellite vessel tracking data a lot is really linked to the background of the study and how we started the study. So back in 2018, Global Fishing Watch was seeking a real-world application to test our existing our advanced machine learning techniques and combine our AIS vessel tracking data with other existing satellite imagery. And at that time, when we had meetings with experts in the region, our local partners explained to us that there were a large number of what is often called dark vessels dark fleets, the vessels that don't broadcast their locations and do not show up in public vessel monitoring system like AIS. Why would they matter? Because these vessels are often not officially or correctly registered to a country, and their catch goes unchecked in any fisheries accounting, making it difficult to have a comprehensive fisheries management in place. So although local authorities in this region suspected that hundreds of foreign vessels were operating in North Korean waters as dark vessels, it was challenging to provide evidence, scientific evidence of their fishing activity. And international dialogue between countries in the region around this fishery, especially the squid fishery we are talking about, we're going to talk about, was deadlocked for years due to lack of transparency in fishing. And we immediately realized that this could be the test case that we are looking for, whether Global Fishing Watch and partners can help shine a light on what these vessels, what these dark vessels were doing in North Korean waters. This was the start of this was the idea of the study. So the reasonable first step we took was to look at this, our AIS tracking data. And unlike what partners told us, we were unable to see any vessel activity, very few vessels active in this region. On the other hand, when we look at this nighttime detection data, which was new at the time that we were about to integrate into our mapping system, it showed hundreds of likely vessels operating in the region. And it's not only in North Korean waters, which is eastern part of North Korean waters, which is in the red circle, but also in the neighboring Russian waters with much lower brightness. So it was very intriguing, first of all. And another fact is that, well, every year, South Korean authorities, including South Korea Coast Guard, continue to observe hundreds of vessels originating from China, crossing through South Korean waters and into North Korean waters. And it's hundreds of vessels, and they observe mainly two types of vessels. One is pair trawlers on your left side, which is about 30 to 35 meters long, that drag huge nets between a pair of them and catch indiscriminately everything in their ways. And the second, the large single vessels on your right side, which is bigger, 60 meters long, that use bright light to lure squid to the surface at night. And these two types of vessels also suggest that these vessels, the hundreds of vessels, originate from China, because only China has this large number of industrial vessels, especially the pair trawlers in the region, and has a historic fishing agreement with North Korea. The industrial lighting vessels on your right, commonly used by Chinese fishers, have very unique features, such as these 4 extendable arms or booms to cast nets, and large structures on board to install hundreds of lights. And these are very, very unique. So you can't really find these same types of vessels in other countries. So it's easy to infer that these are which countries they are from. But it is to note that despite that, what we were unable to verify through satellite observations is that whether these vessels were officially authorized by the Chinese authorities or officially registered to Chinese registry. And compared to these large industrial vessels that I just described of Chinese origin, that use hundreds of light, that generate more light than some football stadiums on your right. If you can count, there are hundreds of lights, bulbs, so it could be up to 700. Compared to that, on your right side, these are very small North Korean artisanal vessels. They are very small, like 10 to 20 meters long only, and they are wood made and use only 5 to 20 lights So there is no way that they compete with these industrial vessels, industrial fleets of 5 to 6 times bigger and who produces light 70, even 200 times brighter to attract catch. So it is likely they, there's no way that these small artisanal vessels compete with these large industrial vessels. And we are going to talk about a little bit later, but these small artisanal vessels are not really fit for long distance travel to catch in the further out in other countries' EEZs. So now I hand it over to Katie. She is going to introduce you to more of regional and ecological context of the study.
Great, yeah. So Jaeyoon mentioned some of this, but we had some hints about what was happening with fishing vessels from various sources, ideas about the vessels in question being of Chinese origin, but we also had some evidence of the consequences of these activities. So popular media from South Korea, Japan, as well as from various sources in North America were showing evidence of not just the fact that these vessels were Chinese and that they were fishing in North Korean waters, but also evidence of these ghost ships that had been kind of washing up on the shores of Japan. And if you're not familiar with them, ghost ships are a term referred to vessels that wash up usually on the shores of Japan that are generally empty or contain only human remains or corpses. So while most of the boats that were washing up, these ghost boats, didn't have any survivors in them, in November 2017, 8 men were found alive in a boat in Japan, and they said that they were, in fact, they sort of confirmed that they were fishermen from North Korea who had gotten into trouble at sea. So it was no secret that the two kind of seemed to be tied, but it was really hard to do anything about it for lack of evidence. So this dynamic, this issue of industrial, oftentimes foreign fishers, expanding or shifting effort into the traditional waters of local fishers isn't exactly new. Expanded effort, particularly by the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, but others as well, has been documented from East and West Africa, from South Asia to Southeast Asia, and further beyond. Oftentimes, the effect of this expansion or shifting of effort is that domestic fishers, with oftentimes, as Jaeyoon mentioned, more basic fishing equipment, basic capital, basic gears, basic navigational technology, they're displaced from these traditional fishing grounds and end up having to fish deeper or farther or in worse conditions in order to access the equivalent catches that they did before. So perhaps another kind of hidden consequence of this invisible fishing effort by these dark fleets are the impacts to the stocks themselves. So the fleets identified by Jaeyoon and the team were targeting largely Japanese flying squid, or Totorotus pacificus. And this is a really important fishery in the region. It's one of the top seafoods consumed in Japan. It's the top seafood by production value in South Korea, and it's one of the 3rd largest exports in North Korea until the implementation of recent sanctions, which we'll talk about. But it's also a fishery showing signs of decline. So while a comprehensive stock assessment throughout its range, which you can see on the top left, is currently kind of a political impossibility, which we'll touch on, there is evidence that catches have been declining, particularly in South Korean and Japanese waters, by over 80% since 2003. Also, while we don't have stock assessments from the complete range of this stock, one recent stock assessment that came out in August, just a couple months after our study, evaluated this particular stock of T. pacificus in the Tsushima warm current region, which is roughly substantially overlapping with the area of our study, evaluated that stock to be, quote, grossly overfished. So this just kind of furthers this idea of the kind of precarity of the stock status, but also the unknown status of the stock status, right? Because the fact that a lot of these fleets are themselves dark means that we're not taking into account a substantial amount of the effort expended to fish them.
Yeah, so in order to address this unregulated catch of this important but poorly managed species, we hope to shed some light on the fishing activity that has not been taken account, as Katie described, for regional fisheries management. We use 4 different distinct satellite technologies to track the activity of these different types of dark vessels. And each of these satellite technologies provides only a partial picture when used in silo separately. But when it is combined, it provides you with a more complete picture of fishing activity. And it is the first time that we combine them all together to publicly expose the activities of dark vessels and their consequences, their catch across multiple years and spanning national waters, most of national waters. And what is really fascinating about this combination of different satellite technologies is that we used machine learning techniques and big data analysis to process such a large amount of data. Here we are talking about tens of thousands of high resolution imagery and positional data, that millions of positional data. So it's a really big data, and also the way that we overlay different layers of data sets to generate new information. And also it opens up new opportunities of detecting fishing vessels that would not have been detected otherwise. And also, of course, this huge amount of data and expertise of processing and analyzing it is contributed to this study not only public institutions, but also by private companies like Planet and others listed here. And this represents the importance and the power of collaboration to make such a big impact. And so these 4 satellite technologies that I just talked about, I'll touch base on each technology very, very briefly. But you can go check our paper, which is open source, and also links to the summary articles at the end of the presentation. So first of all, upper left is the high resolution optical imagery, which offers the best visual proof of vessel activity and type. As you can see, they have very distinctive patterns of fishing operation. These are pair trawlers. They are all in pairs in operation with wake behind it. So we train the machine to detect these types of vessels automatically across tens of thousands of high resolution imagery. And upper right is a radar image, which can identify this large metal industrial vessels here in the picture in red. So they are all in pairs as well. So they are pair trawlers. We can cross-check their numbers and their presence with this optical imagery. And the advantage of using this radar imagery is that this radar detection penetrate clouds. So it detects the vessels regardless of weather conditions, unlike this optical imagery, which is really dependent on weather conditions. And bottom left shows nighttime imaging, which picks up the presence of fishing vessels using lights for fishing operation, especially for this squid fishing. And fleets from different countries use different brightness for their operation, which allows us to distinguish them. Especially in North Korean waters, in Russian waters, it's rather easy to distinguish because different fleets use very different brightness, as you saw in the previous slide, between this industrial lighting vessels and small-scale North Korean vessels. The number of lights that they use are really, really different. And lastly, on bottom right is this AIS, the vessel tracking system, that provides detailed vessel information and track, allowing us to track their vessel movements back to Chinese ports and their operation in North Korean waters. So combining these technologies, we detected about 1,000 vessels operating in North Korean waters in 2017 and 18, despite UN sanctions. They are estimated to have caught more than 160,000 tons of squid worth over 440 million US dollars. And this is really low estimate and very conservative estimate. And this study also found about 3,000 North Korean vessels fished illegally in Russian waters. Due to competition with this large number of foreign industrial vessels present in their own fishing ground, the small-scale North Korean fishers seem to have decided to go further out to fish in the neighboring Russian waters. And the other side of the sea, on Japanese shores, as Katie described, hundreds of North Korean ghost boats washed up in recent years, and in 2018 alone, more than 200 ghost boats were found in Japan. And we found a strong correlation between this number of illegal North Korean fishing vessels operating in Russian waters and the number of ghost boats found on Japanese shores in the past 5 years. So this slide really summarizes what we found in terms of fleets. So and it is estimated, as I said, more than 160,000 metric tons of squid, which is roughly the equivalent and the same amount of squid as South Korea and Japan combined. And this is, we believe, the largest known case of illegal fishing in history, perpetrated by vessels from one country operating in another nation's waters. Now back to Katie, briefing you about implications of the fishing activity.
Thanks, Jaeyoon. Yeah, so trying to think about sort of what all of this means. What are all the implications of the findings, bringing the satellite technologies together to sort of reveal something that hasn't been seen before, but what does that what does it mean? And the first thing that I think it is important to focus on is the implications for management and sustainability of the stocks. So our study uncovered what's really a large number of previously unmonitored vessels targeting these squid stocks and posing a substantial challenge for sort of the future management of these squid. As many of you know, the political stalemates, due mainly to sovereignty conflicts and maritime boundary disputes, have prevented regional joint fisheries management in this area, while existing state-based efforts by South Korea, North Korea, Japan, etc., can be considered good efforts, but are ultimately ineffective because of this lack of shared vessel monitoring data, management arrangements, and a lack of a comprehensive stock assessment, which we mentioned earlier. So for instance, South Korea sets a total allowable catch or attack for squid. They limit lighting power of squid jiggers, they ban paratrawling, and they have a hard cap on permitting for small trawlers. These rules are not in play for a lot of the surrounding vessels that target the same stock, specifically the Chinese fleet that use brighter lighting power. They do use paratrawling, which is an incredibly effective trawling method, and they allow a much greater number of vessels, as we're seeing. So all this to say, attempts at managing the squid stock as a stock are really hindered by this lack of data sharing, this lack of cooperation, and really a lack of conversation within the area. Jaeyoon, you can do the next slide. A second consideration or set of implications that we really wanted to consider were those for legality and enforcement. So one of the main findings of the paper, although perhaps one of the more controversial ones, was that all of this fishing effort that we detected was in fact able to be identified as illegal. Illegality can be a surprisingly difficult thing to definitively determine, but we felt like we really did sort of ran through all the scenarios, and we really did have a strong case for why this activity could be considered illegal by one or more definitions. And this really boils down to the fact that in 2017, 3 UN sanctions effectively prohibited foreign fishing in North Korean waters. I can talk a little bit more about this, but it basically prohibited the procurement of seafood from North Korea, joint ventures between North Korea and other countries without UN approval, and it prohibited the selling or transferring of fishing rights from North Korea. So really kind of got at all aspects or all approaches to foreign fishing that could occur in the waters. And because sanctions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter are binding and implemented via domestic law and policy within China, any violations of these sanctions by Chinese vessels since September 2017 would constitute a violation of public international law and or domestic Chinese law. One thing I want to note is that while illegality is relatively easy to determine in this case, determining culpability or responsibility and thereby determining sort of where to increase enforcement or monitoring is a lot more difficult. So could these be local Chinese fishers that are acting in violation of provincial and national laws? Could these be sort of provincial supported fishers that are, or provinces themselves allowing activities that are illegal at the national or international level? Or could these be, truly state-sponsored violations of UN sanctions? Those are questions that kind of remain. But I did just want to sort of stress what we really see as one of the biggest implications of all of this is the human implications and the human toll that this continues to sort of pay, which is, Jaeyoon mentioned this, but there's over 104 fishing vessels in 2017 that washed up as ghost boats in Japan. That more than doubled in 2018. And I think the numbers were still being determined the last time I checked for 2019, but they remain quite high in the hundreds. And so, these are a huge number of vessels that are washing up with human remains in Japan, oftentimes correlated with this displacement of fishing effort.
Thanks. So going forward, these technologies that we use for this study to detect these different types of vessels, to shed light on dark vessels, estimate the activities of and the catch amount of these dark fishing vessels catch, and also detection of, finding of this strong correlation between this illegal fishing and the displacement of small-scale vessels, and ended up being a ghost boat in the other side of the sea. All these technologies are really easily transferable and replicable. And there is also a growing number of freely available global satellite imagery and global satellite data available. And for those data, satellite data sources that are not yet freely available, such as commercial satellite radar or high-resolution optical imagery, the cost per image is decreasing rapidly in the past few years. So although some aspects of this study are particular to this region, to these types of vessels, for instance, the prevalence of paratrawlers, but still we really hope that these technologies are replicated in other parts of the world, not only in Asia, but also in Africa or other hotspots of IUU fishing, hotspots of competition between small-scale vessels, industrial vessels, or hotspots of dark fishing vessels. These technologies can be replicated quite easily with this increasing number of flow of satellite data. And the key message here is that, at least from the technical perspective, that combining these satellite technologies can reveal the activities of dark fishing fleets, filling a major gap in the management of transboundary fisheries, providing scientific and unbiased information to governments so that they can negotiate, they can take things forward and sit down together and have this regional management plans in place. And these technologies also, when accompanied by local expertise, can identify potential hotspots of IUU fishing around the world. So this is also Global Fishing Watch, and also our partners are planning to deploy all this satellite data freely available for the public and for the researchers and for the governments to use for their informed decisions. Katie?
Yeah. So in addition to some of the things that Jaeyoon's talking about, which is, our team who wrote the paper, we were really excited about kind of two different directions that this work could go. One is what Jaeyoon touched on, which is just really improving the technologies, making the technologies more freely available, more usable for these kinds of applications, and also using them in these innovative ways, like we were able to do, bringing together 4 different technologies that had never been combined before to understand a much more comprehensive picture of what's going on. But we were also excited about not just moving those things forward, but also what are the applications and what can those applications get us. And one of the things that I think is really important to emphasize, especially in this region and in regions where there aren't joint fisheries management agreements in place, places where regional cooperation is strained for whatever reason. Third-party data can help build that trust and build that sort of shared understanding that oftentimes proprietary data or data specific to the government of one country isn't able to provide. So we noted that in 2018, the Inter-Korean summits were able to establish a marine peace zone in the Western Sea on the other side of the peninsula, and that this opportunity really underlined the need and also the ability to build peace and cooperation on the waters. And so we really see the creation of joint fisheries management and specifically between the 2 Koreas, but ideally more broadly throughout the region, as being the ultimate application of this kinds of data and information. And just sort of pushing that point a little further and a little more ambitious, I think most of the people in this seminar know that global fisheries are not particularly known for their transparency. They're not particularly known for open data or for either industry or government accountability, but that there is great potential in improving and increasing that transparency and accountability using tools and using research similar to what we tried to do here.
Yes, and just one more thing to add is that we continue to monitor dark fleets in this region through to the end of this year, so that we will be able to see whether our scientific findings will help make changes on the ground, and also the policies about transparency of the nations in the region evolve. So far in 2019, we saw pretty much the similar level of activities of dark vessels in North Korean waters. And 2020 up to June this year, already we detected about 600 vessels operating, but still it's too early to conclude. But still, by the end of this year, we'll see whether this year we'll have the same amount of fishing activity going on. And also, just to conclude that to achieve this goal of sustainable ocean management, especially this around this transboundary species, we believe that we need more collaboration, not between researchers or like-minded people, but also nations in the region, stakeholders, and through this increased data sharing, information sharing, and also through more innovative technologies that we demonstrate through this study. So with that note, we are going to, I believe we are going to share this slide, and there are different links that provide you with more additional information about this paper and stories and this new analysis and other visual materials that gives you more information if you're interested. So with that note, we end here, and back to Inez.
Thank you very much for the dynamic presentation that included the geopolitics and the technical ways to improve fishing governance. So with that, I'm going to start with the first question from Wei Tervold. Is it possible that Chinese fishing vessels operating in North Korean waters do so with the North Korean government's permission? Are the vessels sponsored by the Chinese government?
Well, that's a good question, and that's also the question we ask ourselves, whether we can find any information. But well, that's probably one of the limitations of the study, that through satellite technologies, we can't really find and verify whether these vessels are spotted by Chinese governments or they are permitted by North Korean governments to operate in their own waters. We obviously found some indications, like some of the pictures of this seemingly fish permit issued by North Korean authorities when South Korean authorities got on board of these vessels from China when they come through South Korean waters. But this is only very occasional indications, but it's not the systematic proof of their involvement of governments. So that's difficult to tell from this study. So, and also that's also why we need these governments and authorities to take this investigation further.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. I think Jaeyoon nailed it, but this is kind of really getting to the heart of the question of the culpability piece that we were able to kind of touch on within the paper, but really were poorly equipped to delve into sort of the long paper trail and the very specific nuances of monitoring, control, and surveillance within this area and within the Chinese fleet itself. The only other thing that I would add is I think this is this part is a real testament to the importance of triangulating remote sensing work with on-the-ground partners. So the piece that Jaeyoon is talking about is some of the evidence that was brought forward by South Korean Coast Guard interdictions within their waters and the papers that were on board the boats in question. And so the little evidence that we have wasn't enough to kind of make a broad sweeping claim about really culpability within the hundreds and hundreds of boats that we saw, but it's a key piece in helping to triangulate evidence and what we're seeing.